Well, ladies and gentlemen, Aspasia is wonderful. I've had the pleasure of speaking with her at Voicecraft a number of times. I always enjoy her contributions and her thoughts, and she's just absolutely outstanding. So it's a pleasure to have a chance to speak with her. We have been talking, interested in sort of the questions of some of the game theory stuff we've talked about, issues of mental health, ways of kind of dealing with how does logic help us or get in the way of mental health? How do we logically end up as our own worst enemy? How might logic help us in life and things like that? But to start, I just got to say, Aspasia, it's wonderful to have you. What have you been thinking about? Where's your mind been going these days? And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. It really is such a joy to have this time to talk to you. I really appreciate you carving out the time. And yeah, I've really loved our conversations during Voicecraft about this topic. Where my mind goes, well, part of the problem is my mind goes in about 30 directions at once. So I'm going to try and pull some of that together. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm a therapist in private practice, but I also have worked in the research world for a very long time prior to that as well. So my mind at the moment has been thinking a lot about therapy and what is it exactly that's going on in the therapy room. And I guess that's been inspired. I've sort of changed the type of therapy that I use relatively recently. So it's much more psychoanalytically informed. It's very intense, I guess, is a way of talking about it. So, and because of that, I've been thinking about why is it that this form of therapy for me seems so much more effective, gives me access to something that I could not get with these other forms of therapy. And my mind kept going back to a conversation we had in Voicecraft around, you were talking about non-rationality, and you were talking about sort of this need to, it's like, you have to step outside of the frame of rationality altogether, but there is also some quality to it that can be like a shock, that can be like doing the weird thing, right? There was some link there between those two things. And when you said that, that just reminded me of at least part of the process that goes on in my therapy room. And I am just talking about mine. I don't want to act as though I'm talking about the whole model that I work in. This is just what I do, my version of it. There is some element that, for lack of better words, can seem weird. It can seem like the weird choice. It can seem like the weird thing to do. And so I guess I'm interested in understanding more from your perspective what you meant by that, like where your mind goes when you think about sort of making the move that seems strange. And I think, as I've been thinking about it, I think some of that is to do with the socially embedded nature, right, of who we are. So it's actually to do with everyone else around you. So what might make it the strange move is, well, the way you've been socialized, but more so than that, how everyone else around you might look at that, right? That they're telling you that would be the strange move. And that actually it might disrupt everything around you. It might disrupt all your relationships, your current relationships. And the idea that you could form other relationships, other connections, sort of fades into the background when you think that this is going to disrupt everything that exists currently. So there's so much I could unpack in all of that. Do you have any initial?
Oh, that's wonderful. I appreciate that all very, very much. Well, it's very interesting. So, the example I always like to use is if you think it's going to rain today, it's rational to bring an umbrella. But let's say it didn't rain. Does that mean you were irrational? No, you were very rational relative to what you thought was true. It just turns out you were wrong. Therefore, it is possible to be rational and wrong. But very often we are led to believe that if you're rational, you're going to be right. But this is very problematic because what it would suggest is that the rational course of action comes after you decide what you think is true. It is not what leads into what you decide is true. But rationality presents itself as if it is truth, that the rational is the true, when in fact, what is rational to you is relative to what you believe is true. But this, of course, begs a really, really strange question. How do you determine what you think is true then? Now, obviously, there's some rational dimension. You chose to believe in the weatherman. But wait a minute, why do you believe in the weatherman? Have you ever met the guy? Do you know the process? It's interesting. There seems to be a difference between the rationality of believing the weatherman and the rationality of following from a premise, right? Those don't necessarily seem to be the same thing. But what tends to happen in society is we only use one word to describe all mental processes that are kind of thinking, rational or irrational. These are too blunt of objects. They're too blunt, and we have them do way too much. And the problem with it too is if we believe that it is merely rationality that leads us to believe it's going to rain today, and then it turns out to be wrong, we may turn around if we then conflate rational and right and say, oh, I must be an irrational person. Oh, there must be something wrong with me. When instead, the issue is that you can't have, say, every occupation. You have to rely on some authority, and you have to trust somebody in some different areas. Like, let's say you're an electrician. You're trusted in the realm of electrician, but you're not a weatherman. You're not a nuclear scientist. You're not a doctor. I could list off a million things. So each one of those people you're going to have to trust. So you find yourself having to do something that's more non-rational. It's neither rational nor irrational, but you have to trust in other authorities because of finitude itself and the division of labor. So there's a social condition that requires you to do something that's more like trusting, where you assent to something that somebody is telling you. And based on that trust, you then determine it's rational to bring an umbrella because you think it's going to rain today. But if you don't notice this non-rational decision that you made to begin that, well, then you might think it's rational all the way down, and you might think your brain is only doing one thing. And as a result, you're not going to understand your own processes to determine how you could do, and this would kind of be the key idea, to determine how is it possible for me to have done something I thought was rational and yet still end up wrong, and that not mean there's something wrong with me. Because once you start going, there's something wrong with me, there's a problem. And then to close, and I'll pass it back to you, the moment though you start talking about all this, about like non-rationality and trust, everyone around you might be like, oh, come on, Daniel, it's just real simple. Bring an umbrella or not. And so the very kind of disclosure of the structure it's thought, for one, can be seen as an making things complicated that don't need to be complicated. So then you're starting to feel like, you're right, maybe I am overthinking things. Maybe it's, this isn't some sort of revelation of the nature of thought itself. And so then you go about your day. So there's first kind of something to be said about the very act of looking into the kind of sinews that make possible very simple decisions that makes you feel like you're weird, that you're doing something strange, because for everyone else, it's just real simple. You listen to the weatherman and you carry it on. And in a way, it is simple, but it's funny how simple things have depth. We tend to think that complex things only have depth, but actually simple things can have a lot of depth. And when you examine that, it also is going to force your brain, which may be used to only thinking in terms of rationality and everything as rational, to start asking questions of how exactly do I think, which in of itself is weird. Because for the brain to ask and to think about what is thinking, how do I even think, has some sort of pain to it, some sort of weirdness to it. And then everyone around you as well can be like, that's weird. And then if there's something like fields or empathy or relations, if everyone around you thinks what you're doing is weird, then you yourself feel like you're doing is weird. And yet this is starting to disclose to you the actual character of thinking that if you don't understand in other situations, it may have consequences for you, say in relationships and so on and so forth. So those are some thoughts to start.
Yeah. This is great. There's a lot of the reason I liked the non-rationality term is that more and more I'm interested in emotions, right? And so the issue here is that there seems to be so much focus on thinking in the thinking brain and how we make sense from a logic perspective. And what's missing in my mind is how you take into account emotions, how you're supposed to take into account emotions in this process. And actually, in the work that I do, the healing, I mean, I'm going to speak in lots of generalities because there's always differences, but overall, the healing mechanism comes from actually letting go of thinking and allowing yourself, therefore, to sort of like reach in and touch these hidden emotions, right? And in doing so, it's the sort of like bringing what is unconscious up into consciousness, and finally allowing oneself to do that through this whole kind of process that you have to do. that displaces, in various ways, that displaces a lot of the symptomatology that brings them in the first place. That relieves the unnecessary suffering. There's always suffering, right? So it displaces undue anxiety. It displaces the depressive mechanisms that are trying to keep everything at bay. It gives you, but more so than that, it gives you, and it displaces all these sort of defense mechanisms that are very thinking oriented, right? Which we can, we can talk about that in some depth. But it also then allows someone access to something, in my mind, that is much more truly them, or some sort of signal, at least, of something about them that has been sort of forgotten, or has been, however you want to frame it, which in having clearer access to that, to your real primary emotions, not your defensive emotions that sit on top, but your primary emotions, it just gives you another pot of information from which to draw in terms of action. Because this is the other really important distinction, and I may be going in too many directions again. So, but there seems to be this distinction that is not clear enough in people's mind about the difference between a sort of a feel, like well, I call an emotion the feeling and the associated impulse, right? The action impulse. But all of that happens inside us. None of that is enacted, right? There doesn't seem to be enough of a distinction in people's mind between noticing a full emotional experience inside them, including the impulse component, versus doing that for real out in the world, right? Actually enacting that. There is a difference. And part of the reason that, well, a big part of the reason that these defensive structures come online in the first place, which work to squash some of these feelings down into our unconscious from our very early days of life, and then subsequently lead to all this sort of symptomatology and suffering that goes on. Part of the reason that these defensive structures come online is because I think of that confusion between the difference of noticing an impulse to do something inside you versus really doing it. And how would I feel about really doing it? It's confused with the impulse of it, just noticing the impulse of it. Is this tracking?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so my mind went to several places as you were talking, but one of them that I'm really interested in your thoughts on is, how do emotions fit into all of this in your mind? And if part of what I'm trying to do in therapy is to get to a point where you're supposed to step outside of the whole frame of thinking per se, and really just have like an emotional experience and get out of your own way to do that. Is that non-rationality? Like, are we stepping now out of the frame of rationality altogether?
That's an outstanding question. So that, there's a few things. Part of the issue is, in the same way that modern philosophy has tried to kind of deconstruct the subject-object divide, because that's been very problematic. The heart-mind divide is also incredibly problematic. The whole idea of the heart and the body being separate has been a disaster. The idea that the mind is located in the brain. The mind is more so the body, not the brain. You have a ton of neurons in your gut, right? And there's the whole idea too, like, you don't realize it, but when you like read a book and you say, oh, that was insightful, is that primarily a logical feeling or an emotional feeling? Well, if you pay attention to the phenomenology, you can't tell the difference. You go, oh, that's insightful. Like, what arguments stand out to you? And you go, that's a good argument, right? It's not merely a logical thing. There is some sort of moment that makes you go, yes, I assent to this argument, right? And so the thing is, if you separate logic and emotion too much, then you actually are separating from logic the component logic needs to actually assent to a case, to believe in something. And actually, it's not by chance that I think when you separate emotion and logic, you end up with a whole lot of anxiety, because logic is always looking for something to land on, but it's denied itself the emotion it needs to land on anything, because that moves to an emotional realm, and oh no, emotion bad, emotion irrational, I'm rational, therefore I should cut that out. Well, then rationality has to end up always kind of spinning, and you end up in a kind of Nash equilibrium, a suboptimal result. The key to the term non-rational is that, the problem is we, for most of history, had rational versus irrational. Irrational bad, rational good, right? Well, it's more like there's rational, irrational, and non-rational. And the non-rational is only obtainable from the position of rationality, ultimately honoring something that it can't reduce to itself. So another way to look at it is if I say that bookcase, which I always use because there's literally a bookcase there. If I say that is a bookcase, this is kind of rational. What would be irrational is to say that is a cat. What would be non-rational is to say the word bookcase is not the same as the phenomenon bookcase. The reason why the last one is non-rational is because you're setting a limit to the term bookcase to open it up to the fullness of the phenomenon. And that's kind of the move you'll see in a lot of non-rationality. It takes rationality to get to the place where you realize the word is not the thing. The map is not the territory. That's a rational move. But rationality is arriving at a place where it honors something outside of it, where it says, the map is not the territory. I had to think to get there. Now that I've gotten there, let me get out of the way of the territory, right? So there's a key non-rational move. The way Heidegger talked about this, because I actually think a lot of 20th century philosophy was kind of orbiting this problem of the relation between emotion, art, philosophy, all phenomenology, but they all had different wording for it, which makes it fun because then there's a million lingos. Like when Heidegger talks about clearing and the idea of thought negating itself, he talks about the negation. He talks about the nihilation. Hegel talks about the negation. There's this notion of thought has to reach a place where it annihilates itself to get out of the way, to create a clearing like in a forest, where then a disclosure of being, a new kind of being can come forth. So what you see, to put it another way, without rationality, emotion can be stuck in impulse or emotionalism. But when emotion uses rationality, it's at risk of being destroyed by that rationality. But if emotion and rationality work together, then you can get emotional intelligence, you can get a trained emotion, and you can get a motivation, motivation, where you then take motivation and sublimate it, as that kind of psychoanalytical term. And now you're using rationality almost like a martial arts for the emotion, to channel it, to direct it. But because, and then I'll give it back to you, because so much of our thinking, though, is haunted by the Enlightenment, and therefore it's like it's either rational or it's irrational, well, then this entire function of thought as trying to annihilate itself, to create a clearing, to have a new kind of being, dare I say a mentally healthy kind of being, a healthy sort of being that is able to understand the limits of thought, and for the sake of emotion, but then it's not controlled by that emotion. Well, now we're talking about the inner space as a kind of martial arts, a kind of dojo, a kind of training ground. But we tend to think of thinking not as training a kind of martial arts, quote unquote, but thinking as more mathematical, arriving at the logic, arriving at the syllogism. Well, then thinking can't be in service of a clearing. It can't be in service of all of these things. And in fact, what thinking ends up doing is if it only believes that it should be rational, then it's ever trying to be rational, and therefore it can never move to an ascent of actually believing in something and thus creating a solid ground by which to live life, because that requires an emotional move. That requires a leap of faith. That requires a taking a step out. So rationality can never do it. So rationality actually becomes a snake eating its own tail. It becomes auto-cannibalistic and it starts devouring itself. And that's really what a lot of, in my opinion, these great 20th century philosophers understood, is that thinking that tries to be its own ground must become self-devouring. But then there's a ditch on the other side of the road where you say, well, thinking just eats itself, so we're not going to do any thinking. we're just going to be emotional, we're just going to just be bodily. But then the problem with that is you can never take the emotions into the realm of emotional intelligence, and you can never sublate them into sustainable relationships, sustainable community, and you never come to a place where you've entered that dojo. So it's almost like when you, and I'll give it back to you, when you put them together, you can turn the inner self, the inner space into something more like a dojo, almost, is the language I'm now using in this guy. Like it makes me think of like Socrates as kind of gymnasium. You turn the inner space into a gymnasium.
Yeah, I love that. As you were talking, I was reminded of that, and I don't know if it's Socrates or Aristotle, the chariot, the three, there's is it like the horse of reason?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to lead the other two.
Yep.
Yeah. No, I like that. I guess where my mind goes is I think more generally, we don't need as much help perhaps with the thinking side of things. And I agree with you that it's a bit of a false distinction. But if we use that language, it's more the sort of, not, I call it non-verbal stuff, that sort of sense of insight or whatever it is, like whether we call that emotion, there's something to it it's spontaneous and it's fast and it's sort of without the effortful nature that thinking something through entails. Like there is a time kind of piece to it, which links back to it anyway. And so what I think needs to happen most of the time is that it's not enough. I agree with you. The idea is not that emotions should be in charge, right? And we shouldn't do thinking. It's the working together of the two is important. But in order to do that, I think most people have been so conditioned out of even knowing what a full internal emotional experience is of anything, or just certain emotions, but lots of others they have no idea. It's all so watery what they experience and would say that's my full emotion, that people need to be able to have the experience first of what that's like in its entirety, with the thinking sort of as offline as it can be to some degree, in order to first experience what that's like before they can make the move to, now I know how to access that and bring it into the equation, right? Bring it into the gymnasium. So that just seems to be really, really difficult to do. And there are all these different forms of therapy, because I used all sorts of different forms of therapy. I trained in many different types of it before I arrived at what I'm doing now. And I just chewed through them, because it's like, well, this is great, this sounds wonderful, but then you can only get so far with people. You can only get so far. And there is something really important about learning how to have a full emotional experience internally, including the impulse, and something about being with another person as you do that, which I think goes beyond just having another person there who's very focused on the same task, helps you to get out of your own way because they can kind of spot things. And it's more than that. I think there is something fundamental about having that with another human being that allows it to work in the way that it does. I think it's a necessary requirement. I don't think it's enough to do it by yourself, but I could be wrong. But there's something about that needs to happen, that people need to learn to do that first before, you can then bring the two things together. That's where my mind went when you're talking about the sort of gymnasium side of things. And I don't know that we have much in society that trains us in that, like it's definitely not happening in the family unit, most of the time. It's definitely not happening with the pressures around parenting, and it's definitely not happening most of the time in the home. It's definitely not happening at school. I don't know. And then, there's all the social relationships, and now there's social media, and there's all this other stuff going on, and everything's going a million miles an hour, and people are being bombarded with all these positive psychology messages and all these messages about, that we can control our emotions. Of course we can't control our emotions, but that comes back to the distinction between action versus internal experience. You can control your action, right? And I think that's what they're talking about, but because it's confused, people are also thinking that they can edit and censor their internal emotional experience, and that should always be happening, that that's actually a sign of health. And it's not. It's a tool you can have. You can use it if you really need to. But that shouldn't be your starting position. That should not be how you know. That's actually just that is something that would be done sometimes. It's not your default setting. So that's where I'm going.
You just said a lot of really profound and important things. So first, on that last point, I think it is extremely problematic that we it's, you know, not to get into the giant debates in moral philosophy about intention and action, but the moment you start saying the internal state is the place of morality, this is really bad, because you actually, the only way, the other thing, I've heard Rick, when he was speaking with Dr. Henriquez, point this out, and I agree with him. We talk a lot about free will when we really should speak about agency, and agency is a kind of muscle we build up. The very fact that you feel things internally you don't like is necessary for you to develop agency. Otherwise, there's nothing you're resisting by which you develop agency. So the very fact that you have an internal place that's crazy, which we all do, I have unicorns and puppies all the time, that is the necessity for the existence of free will, in the sense that free will is actually agency. If you controlled everything, there really would not be anything, because there would be nothing given by which to start choice. There has to be something given that's outside of your control, according to which you could choose, right? Otherwise, it's a void of non-existence or something, right? So the problem is when you have moral philosophies that are like, no, your thoughts are good or bad, your intentions are good or bad. Now, someone like a G.M. Anscombe's more sophisticated than that, but her aside, with her talks on Wittgenstein, there are dangers when you start saying that that is the realm of the moral life. It depends on what you mean by intention as well. That's why I'm kind of bracketing the entire moral philosophy discussion.
We're going very general. We're going very general.
Yes, ma'am. But the entire idea that the internal space is the moral realm versus the between space of self and world, you know, I don't want to just reduce it to utilitarianism, but I also think it's dangerous to, you know, I really do think there's a lot to be said on phenomenology as between material and mind and all of that. But anyway, I think if you don't understand that you need that internal space you don't control to develop agency, then you start having, oh, there's something wrong with me for having these things I don't control, as opposed to, okay, there's stuff I don't control. What am I going to do about it? How am I going to get better? And then not to think about it algebraically, like if I do bad today, I fail forever, but to think in terms of a process, more geometrical, Leibniz, to kind of develop through. If you don't do that, you're going to drive yourself crazy. And this, to me, also shows where framings are a big deal. If you have the wrong framing by which to interpret yourself, that goes a long way to having bad mental health, to speak generally. That can kind of drive you crazy. What you were saying on this starting in a full emotional experience, it is really, really freaking interesting that Plato, in book 7, I think, when he's talking about, or 6, when he's talking about the education of children, he says something like this. He's like, don't you dare introduce them to like learning until at least 10. They should be playing. They should be riding horses. Don't you dare. You'll make them hate it. It's really, really interesting. The other thing I find really interesting is that a lot of people who are very interested in philosophy, if you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, I failed high school. Oh yeah, I never read books. Yeah, I was writing short stories. I was taking a walk in the woods. Like a lot of people who are incredibly all in on philosophy now, they did nothing. They did like sports. I did wrestling. I was walking in the woods. I had a photography business. I didn't freaking read books. I was writing the Sword of Tribulation or whatever, right? Like a lot of these people actually, the thinking comes later. And I think we've made a massive mistake to not understand that, because what ends up happening is if you introduce thinking too soon or in the wrong way, it suggests that life is in service of thinking as opposed to thinking in service of life. And instead, what you got to do, because I think what Socrates says is the key when kids are young is you introduce them to wonder. And wonder becomes the engine of thought, where you go, wow, that's a tree. And you go, hey, kid, how do you know that's a tree? I don't know. Isn't that crazy? Like, you know that's a tree, even though you don't know that's a tree. So you've introduced them to a mystery. You've introduced them to wonder. You've introduced them to something that makes them go, that's weird, or whoa. And the reason that's important is because then if they begin thinking, they're thinking in order to honor something in the world that they're relating to that is not reducible to them. They're trying to think, to figure out, or to better relate to the world. Well, now it's fundamentally relational. And if you can get them to do that with a tree, well, then they might do that with people. And if you don't do that with people, you're in big trouble. So there's something there's some ancient, I mean, to your point, it's also like what Socrates seems to be saying is you need to introduce kids to the sweat, the strain of the wrestling match and make them go, you need to make them breathe. I'm also thinking now, Michael Crawford, Shopcraft is Soulcraft. Tactile Knowledge by Michel Panier, and he's a genius. And all of these thinkers, and there's just this classic tradition when you look at education, where they there was this sense of you must have the kids introduced to the full emotional experience, the art first, or else learning is going to be a disaster. That's really what's kind of nuts. They're almost like, no, learning will be bad. It will be bad for them to learn. There's this sense that thinking, I heard Matthew Stanley say this once, it's like, there's something about rationality that's kind of like a mental illness. Like there's something about rationality that is like a mental illness if it is not trained, if it is not put in the right order, if it is not put in the right way. And what you see, and then I'll give it back to you, what you see in Socrates and Plato is this deep awareness of that, this deep understanding that kids should not be given like books until they're like, it's like 10, but it's almost like 15. It's like, they don't need this stuff. Like as they get older, and here's the key, as they're trying to figure out how to run the polis or relate to society in complicated ways, sure, bring it in. But really, you must start with this fullness of life that then thinking is in service of honoring, not present thinking in the way of life. If thinking is in the way of life, it's almost like a mental illness. Well, it's a Nash equilibrium of different things.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think bringing the thinking online too rapidly and with too much focus narrows your existence, right? It's just narrowing your frame straight away. And the fact that it happens so early on, is hard not to think about as somehow, done on purpose to just like restrict people's, we want to get conspiratorial. And yes, absolutely. Rationality can be a mental illness, and it definitely forms a big part of the defensive structure of lots of people that I see, this overuse of rationality, and it's done to avoid emotions, or it's done to avoid anxiety that comes from suppressed emotions. I was smiling as you were talking because it's so interesting to me. Whenever I talk to you, you always seem to bring up something that I have not explicitly said, but refers to something that has like been on my, so this morning I opened up an old notebook of mine, and it was just a blank page, and all it said, I'd written down the words, the rigor of mystery. And I had no idea, right? I don't even know what it means, but I wrote it down. And then when you were just talking now, when you were using the word mystery and you were talking about wonder, it really just, it brought that idea back up for me. There is something about mystery and wonder that is rigorous if we lean into it. Like it can point to important things. And this idea that it's sort of fanciful, and that we should then bring our rational minds online. And it always amazes me when those sorts of things happen. So I was kind of just in my own little moment of wonder, OG. And now it's hard to get back on track. But yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Everything that you were just saying. There is absolutely a place for thinking and training thinking, but it's overdone. There is nothing that balances it as well. And there is this kind of attempt, at least in the school system here, to talk about emotions and start to, all of this thing, connect into our bodies and breathe. And But it's all still done through the same framework. Like it's not, you know, they're trying to, it doesn't fit. They need to just sort of start from the ground up. But yeah, I'm kind of in my own little moment of wonder. I'm trying to think what the next place is that my mind goes.
Oh, well, just not to interrupt, I really appreciate what you were
No,
saying.
please.
But, you know, it's interesting when we think about rigor, because I always think about Cézanne, the painter, right? And imagine the discipline it takes to look at something as hard as he did. The rigor it required to, to paint a bowl of fruit like he did. Like, we tend to think of rigor. Well, one of the things that actually I think has really gotten us in huge trouble is overemphasizing art as personal expression, as just a kind of free-flowing expression, when actually the art as skill, like that is getting more at what rationality is supposed to be. Because like when we think about, is Cézanne the painter rational? Well, yeah, but it's not a technical rationality. It's more like this full, someone like Hegel's going to say it's reason. You know, there's a distinction between reason and rationality. Everyone makes different language games. But generally, what's interesting about the artist, and why for me the phenomenology of the artist is really important, is because what you see in that activity is some sort of bringing together of the emotional, the intuitive, the intellectual, the bodily all together. But by not really looking closely at what the artist does, it has not been able to function as a mental model for what the intellectual should do. And that's gotten us in huge trouble, because what the artist is doing is actually what the economist should be doing, what the scientist should be doing, what the philosopher should be doing. Like I think about like a Flannery O'Connor, you know, she always emphasizes that the writer must not be afraid to gag, like, you know, God, like stare so hard at something. And, you know, and I think of a Robert Olson Butler and how incredibly difficult it is to truly describe a scene in literature. You know, if you say, oh, I walk down the hall, Olson Butler would be like, that's an abstraction. You don't walk down the hall. You hear the creaking of the board on the oak wood as the brisk morning air through the open window reaches your lungs on the way to grandmother's bedroom. That's more of what you're doing. But notice how quickly the brain goes to the abstraction of, I walk down the hall. Right there goes to show you why thinking tends to be a problem, because it naturally generalizes and compresses to the point where you lose the fullness of the experience. Well, someone like a Robert Olson Butler is like, that's why most creative writers aren't any good. That's why most painters aren't any good. And you see, if we pay a really close attention to the phenomenology of the artist, and that, because like a great short story, let's take James Joyce's The Dead. Did James Joyce just, or Little Cloud or whatever, did he just sit down and say, I'm just going to do whatever I want? No, there were principles, there were laws, there were rules. And yet here's the key. The rules of the story were inseparable from the writing of the story. You could not separate it. This is the other problem, is we too much as philosophers or intellectuals or whatever tend to do mental puzzles where you can separate the laws of the puzzle and thinking from the thinking. But that's not what you see in the short story. The short story, the logic of the short story is inseparable from the short story itself. Well, what's that? That's a combination of mind and heart. That's a combination of thinking and emotional. So if the philosopher, the intellectual and the thinker, and I think it's for therapy, mental health, all these things, like, what is the artist doing when they're at their, you know, the world-class artist? What are they doing? This kind of thinking seems to be, whatever we want to call this, one could call it phenomenology, one could call it, this particular mode of thinking seems to be similar to the thinking of constructing of a relationship, constructing a marriage, constructing an identity or a self or description, because the artist is creating out of nothing, in a way. They can do whatever they want to do. There's a way in a relationship where you can do whatever you want to do, and yet you can at the same time. The artist, in a way, can create anything, and yet they also know they can't create anything, that there are principles that have to be followed. Well, now we're talking about a mystery. Now we're talking about a relationship. And, you know, so to me, the rigor of mystery, that kind of language really points to what an artist is doing, the rigor of the writing, the rigor of the painting, the rigor of description, which leads to the rigor of relationships. But since we haven't really had, in my opinion, a robust understanding of the practice of the artist as a kind of model by which to engage in thinking in humanity, we've not been able to then apply it to, say, education, to therapy, to relationships, to thinking. And as a result, all of those are kind of missing the rigor of mystery. They're either on the side of logical rigor, and you say, oh, it must be true because this like logical rigor that the philosopher is doing is so difficult. Just because something is rigorous and difficult does not mean it's true or useful. It could just be some sort of complicated alchemy, right? Or something like that, right? But then at the same time, just because you're sitting around talking about the mystery, ooh, mystery, emotion, well, that doesn't mean you're approaching it or getting better at it or training the kind of gymnasium of the internal side. You have to get the rigor of mystery, if I use that phrase, and that bothness, that very strange bothness, and I'll give it back to you, seems to be what you're seeing more in the creative act, in the artistic act. So then what does it look like as a philosopher to do that? What does it look like as a therapist, as an educator, as a family person, as in a relationship? What would it look like to bring that kind of mode of activity that you see in the creative act to other areas? So those are some thoughts that come to mind.
I've always thought of therapy as an art, and I've always thought of relationships as it's an art. And so all of this is tracking. All of this is tracking. When you were describing the two different ways of writing, right? And there's the walking down the hallway, and then there's that expanded version. You know, if you just read someone is walking down the hallway, I think it abstracts things. So even if you are writing about yourself, I think the where you go in your mind is to just sort of imagine a figure, like it's almost, you imagine a figure walking down a hallway. It abstracts it into, yeah, like into something outside of yourself. Whereas when you describe the second one, it elicits the experience within you, right? Because it's involving all the sensory components, and it's involving, you know, so much richness of data input that all of a sudden, and it comes, well, at least for me, it comes over me, right? Like I'm not sitting there going, well, I'm going to engage with this now in a manner that's going to allow me to now experience it. It just happened as you were saying those words. I had no say over it, right? And so this is the sort of bottom up, what I would call more the emotional component, right? Whatever you want to call it. I'm not applying anything top down. And so the difficulty, I think, in the therapy room is that even if you can sit with a person and over a lot of time have them sort of see the issue and sign up to this idea as something that's, you know, important for them and that they want to do, and they can understand what it might achieve for them. And it's very, very, well, in some cases, lots of cases, it's very, very hard for them to finally make the move right. And so I'm trying to get clearer in my own mind about exactly what it is that allows someone, and I do think, I don't think we can avoid the role of something like trust and faith and just taking a leap. And I mean, all of this language is in all the, you know, in all the sort of psychoanalytic texts, and it's, you know, the sort of leaping into the dark and the, like all of this. There is a moment to make a choice, which again, I think goes back to why I liked the non-rational language, because it's making a choice that, I don't know, is not necessarily logical, or I don't know how you frame it, but you are making a scary choice where you're just sort of throwing yourself at something and holding on, not knowing what's going to happen, even though you might have hopes for it. And it's incredibly confronting for people to do. And so I'm trying to, and to me, yeah, there's a mystery to all of that. What is that moment that they finally take the leap? And like, you know, and obviously there are conditions that get set up for it, and obviously the therapist has a role, and the work you do beforehand has a role, and you know, all of that. But I do I still think that it still catches me off guard. So yes, there are times when I might be able to predict, well, I think that now we're kind of in the right territory, and I think it's, we've got a good chance of it happening very soon. But sometimes I have no idea why it happens. And so there is, there is definitely the element of wonder and mystery during therapy that plays a role. And it's also, I mean, it's also as therapist, right? When I am there and I am connected, I don't really know what I'm doing half the time. Like, it just sort of takes over me, right? Like, there is that sort of, like you're trying to know what you're doing outside of session, and then when you go to session, it's just sort of a letting go, and it's just how closely can I connect to this person? How close will they let me, right? How closely can I connect with them? And just trusting that in that something might eventuate. I mean, there's obviously more to it than that, but that seems to be the most important component for me at the moment, is really just the connection. And then sort of there's a trust that comes alongside that will, yeah. So yeah, I don't know if that sparks anything for you.
It's outstanding. So a few things. So I've come to be on the non-rational era. An example that I've really come to like, and it was brought to my attention by Joel. There's a lovely article by Agnes Callard called Why to Be Angry Forever. And what the article is explaining is that if somebody does something to you that hurts you, then you have a reason to be mad forever. Because the fact is they did something terrible to you, so you always have reason to be mad. The argument's more elaborate than that, but it's basically that. If you find out that you misunderstood them, then Agnes would say, well, then there actually wasn't a reason to be mad at them. You just thought there was. But if there truly was a wrong done to you, then you always have a reason mad to be forever. So now the question is the following, just like the book The Sunflower on forgiveness. Should you forgive them? Well, if you actually look at it, no, you should not. There is no reason to forgive them. It wouldn't, because they actually did something wrong for you. And yet we all kind of know that not forgiving them could be disastrous. It could be a burden. It could have a lot of consequences. But here's the trick. Is it irrational to forgive them? Well, no, because the consequence, it sounds like we need a third category. It's non-rational to forgive them. This is the issue. Like, the forgiveness as a topic can actually cause a lot of people a lot of agony because they don't have the category of non-rationality. Because it's like, is it rational to forgive them or not? Well, they did something terrible to me, so it's not rational to forgive them. But then that would mean that rationality would force you to never forgive anyone ever. And that right there would show the limits of rationality. But then it would seem wrong to say it's irrational to forgive them, right? That doesn't seem correct. Well, there needs to be a third term, non-rationality. That's what you have to do in game theory to avoid the Nash equilibria. If someone hurts you, and it's therefore rational never to forgive you, rationality leads to a suboptimal result. Well, that's Nash equilibria. That's when everyone does what's rational and they end up in a suboptimal result. So in order to actually get the most optimal result, you have to do something that seems to be irrational, which is to forgive them. That's actually non-rational because it doesn't fit within the schema of the immediate facticity. Once you do it, then life unfolds differently, and you see that it was actually a good choice, even though it wasn't a rational choice. That's the key. In the same way that you were rational to bring an umbrella, even though it didn't rain, it's possible to be rational and wrong. Well, likewise, it's possible to do what's not rational and be right, ergo non-rational, right? And so, as another note, just as to kind of overlook, Benjamin Fontaine warned, very much like Adorno and Horkheim in the Dialectics of Enlightenment. This is a Jew under Nazi occupation. He's like, hey, fascism and Nazism was rational. And the only way, if all you have in society is rationality, you will end up in totalitarianism. Because do you know what's really rational? Power. and totalizing power. So as a little side note, in the same way that the lack of non-rationality leads you into these never forgiving anyone, these relational problems, it actually has real mega socio-political ramifications as well that we have to think through. And so Benjamin Fontaine is also very important. But on what you were saying about the mysterious moment, I think what you're suggesting there also really hints and points to why indeed therapy has a lot to do with the arts. And I think about creative writing. There's some really weird moment when you're reading a book that you forget you're reading a book. How did that happen? Where did that occur? Just suddenly you're not reading a book. You're in the Shire. You're in the story. You're in a movie in your head. Where are you? I don't know. I'm in the bathtub as an 8-year-old. But you're not. You're in Wedged or something, right? You're in Ender's Game, right? So there's a mysterious moment where you're looking at black marks on white page, but you're not. You're here and you're there at the same time. It would seem that therapy has to do something similar, where there's a mysterious moment where you're no longer in therapy, quote unquote. You're then in something more, right? Now, how does a writer create the sentence structure so that the reader ends up in the movie and they're suddenly taken, they're teleported. We'll say teleported, I suppose. Well, they have to make the words invisible on the page. What? The words aren't invisible on the page. What does that even mean? Well, you can't have any misspelling. The sentence structure has to be good. The imagery has to be dynamic. And if you ask a writer, how do you do it? A good writer, a lot of times they'll say, I don't know, but it happens. They can intuit it, right? It's very similar, I think, to therapy. Because here's the trick. They have to, when they're reading the book, enter into this movie, because otherwise the rational mind runs in and ruins everything. It's guessing. It's defending, oh, this is not very good. Oh, that's a stupid character. Oh, I know what the twist is going to be. So what happens when you're reading a book that's not done well? The rational mind is ruining the experience the entire time, right? So likewise, what happens in therapy, the rational mind is saying, well, it was her fault. Well, he did it. It's running in, right? So but the issue is, I would argue good philosophy makes you forget you're doing philosophy. If you know you're doing philosophy, you've blown it. You're actually supposed to like people are like, oh, Daniel, you like philosophy. I'm like, oh, I guess that's what it's called. You're supposed, like, philosophy is just supposed to be what happens if you talk long enough or you go deep enough. It's not supposed to be an intentional kind of thing. So when you do it well, it has to kind of vanish, right? Likewise, when you do writing well, it kind of has to vanish in the same way that therapy has to vanish. But here's the problem. By not realizing that mind and emotion, heart and mind, all of these things are so connected, we have not realized that the point of thought is to be an art of creating these moments of invisibility, these moments of teleportation. We have thought that thought is about solving problems as opposed to being an art that brings together heart and mind to create these experiences of teleportation. Of self-forgetfulness is another term, where you forget yourself, like a flow state, where you just suddenly are in the full emotional experience, where you're being vulnerable. Like if you ask someone, be vulnerable, that's going to guarantee they aren't. Likewise, if you tell them, have an artistic experience, enjoy this story, they won't. You have to make them be vulnerable without realizing it. You have to make... They have to, it's like a magic trick in a way. It's like there's a kind of magic trick. Magic trick is always a bad word because it sounds like a trick, but it's like magic.
I like it.
Yeah, it's good. So there's a moment, but you see, because we've, and then I'll give it back to you, because we have had the incorrect mental model by which to think about what thinking is, then we have used thinking to solve problems as opposed to be a kind of figuring out how to, from an inner gymnasium space, use thought and emotion to create these effects of teleportation. And that is the place of new being. That is the place of transformation, but that is not how we've been able to understand what thinking is, probably because we introduced thinking too soon, probably because we don't think about art and philosophy and therapy and all these things together, and also because we don't even know what thought really is about. Nor do we really understand that rationality doesn't equal truth. Rationality is simply one tool in the toolbox of figuring out how to make that moment of teleportation occur. But I give it back to you.
Mm, mm. Oh my God, there's so much there. Yeah, so the rational impasse here is it's the oversimplification, right? It's a result of an oversimplification of something that is much more complex. And human, I mean, relationships, there is nothing really more complex than two people trying to relate, right? To some degree, if you're trying to approach it. So there will always be rational impasses.
Yep.
And there is something, you're right, that when you're in therapy and it's going incredibly well, from my point of view, it's like an immersion, like it is like an embeddedness in this experience, like and everything else drops away, and it really just is the relationship, and that's incredibly hard to do sometimes for people. There is even as you described that example of forgiving someone, I just can't help it. In my mind, I go back to, like, it's still, for me, it's still not even defined well enough. Like, I just think that the nuance is so lost currently between when we say to forgive, what are you talking about? So many people that I see think that forgiveness means I no longer notice I feel angry towards the person. If I still notice anger inside me, then I haven't forgiven them, right? Again, it's mistaking our emotional signals inside and our emotional experience inside for how we behave, right? And how we're going to choose to relate to this person, and if we're going to open up again or not open up again. And so in order to forgive them, I now have to use my mind to convince myself that I'm not angry with them, or that there is no anger inside me. And then I notice, though, that I can't do that for long enough, and anger comes up, and oh no, I'm a bad person now because I haven't forgiven them, because look, there's still anger inside me towards this person. And in order to be in a relationship with someone and truly love them, I cannot feel anger towards them. Like, it's this splitting mechanism and this oversimplification that is occurring even in the realm of emotions, I guess, as the result of this rationality, perhaps, that is oversimplifying people and oversimplifying relationships. And it also comes about, though, because of that confusion between what I notice feeling inside as an emotional experience versus how I can then choose to act in the world, right? That there can be a distinction between the two. Really, really difficult concept, Daniel, for some people to get clear on. And I don't, I mean, I do understand some of the reasons for that. But it is, yeah, it is incredibly difficult. And so, so at least in my work, what is really helpful, anger is a really good place to start, because I think that is such a demonized emotion, and it is one that so many people would sign up to the idea that in order to have that in a relationship, that's destructive, right, in some degree, right? And yet it is it is a primal biological, sort of signal that occurs that's trying to give us information about something. Right. And if we are trying to block that, or we are then turning that back around on ourselves because we notice that we're feeling it towards someone we love, or it actually, the way in which we relate to having that feeling in particular causes all sorts of suffering and issues in our life. It causes disconnection. It causes loneliness. It causes us to behave in ways that we do regret. There's all sorts of, it causes us a whole heap of anxiety. It causes depression. It's a really good emotion to start with people, because I think it is so monsterized in society. And I think if we're going to start anywhere, that's a really good one to use as an example, because people have no idea how to relate to noticing that they feel angry. And if anyone ever comes to see me and they talk about being angry, or anger, they're almost always talking about the action, like acting in a particular way. They're not actually talking about the internal experience of anger. They usually can't even describe to me what it feels like inside, other than it's very quick, or it feels very anxious, right? And And then they just describe a whole set of behaviors that they do, which is in general behaviors that probably come about as an anxious discharge, and it's more to do with anxiety than it is to do with anger. So I'm kind of, anything come up?
Magnificent. So a bunch of things. First off, what you were saying about this moment of immersion, I think when a lot of people today talk about embodiment or being present, they're trying to get at that. The problem, though, is if you don't emphasize the artistic process, then basically what you tell people think, oh, I can be embodied by just not thinking. No, it's a quality of thinking that forgets itself. Because I'm almost at the point where I want to say that the point of thinking is to forget itself. Like thinking exists to achieve a kind of thought forgetting, not thoughtless, but a kind of forgetting itself, that because thought forget itself, it creates the possibility of a quality of emotion that has a certain meaning and depth that would not be possible if you never had thinking at all. So there's something about thinking that is about the ability to clear itself so that you have an emotional experience of mystery that's deeper than would be if you never had thought at all. So there's some issues where, yes, when we talk about being present or being embodied or getting, out of our heads, we can mean entering that state of immersion. But notice that the only way the artist is able to create that effect of forgetting yourself while reading the novel is because they use thinking to create the conditions where you could forget yourself. So the question is how to use thinking to forget itself, how to use emotion for the sake of motivating thought, and then to have thought serve emotion. Again, there's this gymnasium that's going on. So there's this certain kind of overall effect that is not reducible to the non-physical, nor is it reducible to the physical. And it's more like the creative product. The product of the artist is a mixture between idealism and materialism, mind and body. It's both at the same time. And if we look at it clearly, then the question is, okay, how do I do something like that in art? And I like the word art over skill because art entails skill, but it's not reducible to pragmatism. And so how do I do something like art in education, in therapy, in family, in relationships, et cetera, so forth? Because art is the mixture between idealism and materialism. Now, on what you were saying on anger that I think is so important, basically, if you believe having the feeling of emotion of anger is bad, then thought is in service of either thought has to be in service of self-deception or self-repression. Thought cannot be in service of creating this art, of being an art. And I'll just say that for short to mean the creation of this condition that we're describing of the teleportation, the art. Art does this. Well, because what you're saying is I shouldn't feel that. I'm a bad person. How do I make myself not feel that? By being a robot. Okay. By dying inside? This is not good. Like one of the worst conflations. But one of the reasons why I think we actually get convinced that's kind of this repression or making ourselves not feel this is the way, because it's kind of like the mirror inversion of the state of self-forgetfulness. Like the correct state is a certain fullness where it's like completely saturated as a human and you have the mystery, but this is the kind of absence which is isomorphic, but it's the opposite of it. So that's one of the reasons why we can kind of fall for this. But if you start saying, like, people will say, oh, you forgive someone once you forget, right? And by forget here, I mean different than the self-forgetful that Timothy Keller, the flow state, okay? That's more of an ego forgetful. The problem with that is you are literally then saying it is a virtue to have a lack of capacity. To not remember something is a virtue. Really? And so then if you have good memory, it's a vice. Like this is one of the worst things that happens is when you separate mind and body, then then it's possible to end up with these true perversions, which is that forgetting is forgiving is forgetting. You are saying that to forgive then is to be lacking something as a human being, and also to do the impossible. And what that then means is, since I would argue, I don't know if I've ever chosen to forget something. Is that even possible? Can you choose to forget something? Well, I don't think you can. But if that's what you tell people, then you are telling people basically, well, what you're doing is you're setting them up to fail. And because if they go into a relationship and especially if it's a diverse relationship, like notably diverse, well, then the probability of misunderstanding is high, which then means hurt is high, at which point they will feel like a bad person unless they can forget the hurt, of which they will find is impossible. And then people will say, why do I even try? And so you've created a moral premise that contributes to isolationism, atomization, and then we wonder why pluralism is failing, why everyone is in tribes. Well, because you've created moral premises that set people up to feel like bad people if they end up in relationship or try to create community. So the stakes are very high. And this would be an example, what's very funny, this would be an example where something like rationality and philosophy is important but it's for the sake of identifying a false premise. That's kind of the key. Like rationality is almost more useful for identifying false premises that are keeping you from living than it is for living itself. Like it's more of a clearing function, a negation. I'll talk about philosophy as self-defense. It's more like, because someone's going to come along in your life and tell you, hey, if you don't forget this happened to you, then you're not forgiving. And if you don't have philosophy, you may go, that sounds right. And now you're screwed. So you've got to have thinking for self-defense, but you must not overfit self-defense as being all you need to live a life. Because once you then decide, hey, that premise forgetting is forgiving is, once you realize that's false, well, that's not the same as actually going into community. You now have to go into community and actually do the thing, right? But rationality was able to help you, because I'm using rationality and philosophy interchangeably here, if you grant me that, it helps you from falling into these kind of mistakes that someone's gonna come along and present you with one of these mistakes. And if you're not able to clear it, annihilate it, then you're probably going to absorb it. It's going to seem plausible because it seems plausible, and then you're going to be in trouble, right? And so it's really important not to make these mistakes. But the key is, like you're saying, I would argue anger, and then I'll give it back to you. Basically, every single emotion is actually a bothness of a good and bad. So what I mean by that is the very thing that leads to lust also is the eros that leads to love. So if you want to get rid of feeling lust, you also have to get rid of the eros that makes possible love. Anger is also, do you really want to live in a world where there's no anger at all? You know what that would mean? Is that people were not bothered by injustice. People were not bothered by evil. Really, you don't want any anger. Anger is the very emotion that compels people to righteousness. So if you get rid of anger entirely, you must also get rid of the compulsion for righteousness, right? So this is the problem. This is why that whole idea of feeling is so bad, is because what we do is we separate the feeling for righteousness from anger, when although they are manifestly different, they are substantively the same. They are substantively the same essence. The question is the ordering, the question of what to do with it, right? Like the same with eros, the three eros, logos, and eros, logos, and thymos, like in the classical soul. So all three of those, the problem is all three of those horses, because I think Aristotle, those horses, all of them have good versions and bad versions of the same horse. And so the name of the game can't be to not feel that, because that means you've also gotten rid of the virtue. It has to be about the training and ordering of it, which is kind of the prime function of thinking. This is the prime function of rationality. I feel anger, then the examination, is this righteousness or is this being mean? Let me think about it. Why do I feel this? What are you doing then? Suddenly, rationality is using philosophical examination more so as a kind of therapeutic or psychoanalytical kind of function. I know those aren't the same, but you're using it to ask the why behind the emotion. Because what is rationality doing? It's looking for a why. Well, without rationality, you couldn't ask for the why behind emotion to figure out the ordering of the emotion and then how it might motivate the creation of an art by which relationships could enter into the flow state. So there's a multi-step, but let me get back to you.
So good. So good. I've got like 5 things that I need to try and remember to address. But just on that last point, there is a distinction too, though, that there is a trap people can fall into that, oh, I got a whiff of anger inside. The belief that they're even able to know, that they're even able to stop, and if they think long enough, they'll know why. That's not always true, right? And then we can get stuck in that as well, which goes back to my original point about it's not enough to have some access to the emotion. People have to know what it's like to have a full experience of the emotion where it doesn't get prematurely cut off, because it's often getting prematurely cut off by lots of defensive rationality and thinking and like stuff coming on to cut it off. And if you are fooled into thinking that, oh, I got a whiff of it, now I'm going to sit down and really get very sort of rational and logical and think through what happened and how does that relate to the past, and do I have a that in and of itself can be a mechanism that keeps you from the full experience of the feeling. And it's not until you have the full experience of some of these feelings that you can know the why. Sometimes you have to go through the emotion, and that shows you why, because it's the access. This goes back to the unconscious element. It's the access point to the unconscious. Then the why reveals itself. So this is not always, right? But this is in a therapy context. You know, you need, and that is the leap of faith, is that you can sign up to the idea that you might never be able to figure out a why until you go through the full internal experience of the emotion. And so you don't even have a whiff of what the why might be. And do you want to sign up to that? Do you want to find out the why? What might that mean? How, you know, like really? And you know, and everything else that comes with it. So there is that component too that I think is really important. It's not enough that we have some preliminary signal of an emotion inside us and we think, oh, great, I noticed that I felt angry towards that person, and that's enough necessarily. For many people, that initial whiff is actually tied to a whole heap of stuff that's been shoved underground, emotions that have been cut off from conscious awareness. And they are highly motivated, unconsciously so, to only get a little peek of the emotion and quickly move along, quickly problem solve it, figure out what I'm going to do in this situation. And when we bring our rational faculties online, or our sort of our cognitive faculties online, that works to reduce our contact with the feeling. It actually does start to weaken our connection to the feeling. So there is a point in which we need to get out of the way and stop doing that in order to have the full experience. So there's that piece as well. But hold on, I've scribbled something down here I need to try and figure out. So also, again, when you were talking about being able, I think what you were talking about was being able to discern whether or not what someone is telling you is bullshit or not, essentially, right? You know, it's like that they present you with some premise or some idea, and that philosophy can help you. It's obviously very useful. It's a tool that you can use to figure out whether or not, you know, that makes sense and you want to follow suit. I agree, but I also think there is a role again for something that is non-verbal, that is more emotional, that actually there may be something that just happens inside you that you can't put words to that gives you a sense already. And I'm not saying that that's always reliable either, because you have to kind of know what that's about. But it's both again, though. I think that they do go hand in hand, and they're both important, and they should both be trained, right, to work in concert. And then you talked about what you call thymos, which again is amazing, because that's the other concept that you've been talking about a lot recently that I wrote down that I want to talk to you about one day. And I have to, just because I have my Greek father in my head telling me it's thymos. It's not thymos. I have to do that for him. So if you don't mind me calling it thymos rather than thymos, there is something about that concept, and this goes back to mystery and wonder, that the moment that you presented it completely caught my attention. I have no idea why. I've read a bit about it. I don't really know how it relates to what I'm talking about, but I think that has some role in all of this. And so that's something I kind of need to, but again, it's kind of just trusting that welling up inside me in the moment, that thing that captures my attention, and going, well, that's necessary and important in this somehow. So that's important. I've got two more things I wrote down. Oh, forgetting. What was it? To forgive and forget. Actually, I think this goes back to what I just said before about You don't always know the why. So there is a manner in which we might think we've forgotten something, but we might emotionally remember it, but it's completely cut off from all the context. And so it still plays a role in our day-to-day life. It still plays a role in our relationship with a person. So there's also that to contend with, but there are different forms of forgetting. What's this? Thinking. The way that you were describing that you need to use rationality and you need to use thinking. I was thinking about therapy when you were talking about the clearing aspect. And you're right, because there are really important conditions that you have to set, right, in the sort of therapy that I do. I mean, I think in any therapy, before you would get to a point where you're going to try and just have a full internal emotional experience and a breakthrough of unconscious material, and and those conditions are very much, I guess, that clearing, and that you are using rationality and logic and thinking as your tools to do that. You are trying to help the other person get clear on what might be the error here. What move might you be making here, thinking that you know what's going on, but actually, if we look at it, do you really know what's going on? Do you really understand the costs associated with it? Do you really understand your role in it and your sort of like self-perpetuating of some of this? And once you get very, very clear on all of that, which is not emotional, right? Once you get very clear on that, that sets the conditions where now we can kind of go to the emotional realm. So I really liked that because that sort of pulled some of those pieces together for me. But you still have to be able to have some place in life where you can learn about what it means to have a full internal emotional experience, because I still don't think there's enough places for that. And I do think, I do think that is part of what people are seeking out in some manner without knowing it too, though. Anyway, that's where I'm at.
I think it's outstanding. I think basically when a lot of people say, like, let's form community or talk about community, really what they should be talking about, or they may mean by that, is the creation of spaces of full emotional experience, because that is what people are lacking. And in fact, when people join community, if that is not there, because there's some sort of intuition that this is what is kind of needed, and if it is not there, then there is a piece missing, according to which all of the other pieces cannot come together. Emotional intelligence, intuition, rational. There's this kind of core sort of, oh, life is possible. This is what it's like. And this is when it all comes together. Okay, this is the telos. Aristotle talks about the final mover, what is the final cause? What is the thing that's kind of everything's being moved toward, right? And it's just very interesting because in Aristotle's metaphysics, everything is basically about the movement, like why, it's the weird question of everything moves, everything changes, and yet I also, as it changes, can still identify it as itself, a weird paradox that's at the heart of everything. Well, what is everything changing? For Aristotle, he's like, well, everything changes towards something or as something, and if you can't identify what is the telos or the movement or the cause, then you can't even really understand what a thing is. And basically, without the full emotional experience, we lack the final cause according to which we can identify what all these things are that we are describing. Some people talk about the beatific vision. Some people talk about the glimmer of eternity through the transient. Some people talk about, all of these experiences where you say, yes, I've glimpsed it, capital I it, if you will. It's this mixture of the Platonic and the emotional. Oh, okay, everything is in service of that. I get it now. Well, without that experience, then you can't get it now, by which to then order everything. And so for Aristotle, everything is supposed to kind of move in a certain way, thinking, emotion, everything. But if you don't know the final cause, then it can't move rightly. It can't be the Dante dance. It can't have this dance quality to it. The tricky thing, it's very interesting. Heidegger at one point in one of his letters wrote the word being with a dash through it. Every time he wrote a dash through it. And Derrida was really interested by this. Basically, for me, what's very interesting is that basically every word the human uses need a dash through it. So when we talk about the why of emotion, it has to have a dash through it. Likewise, intuition has to have a dash through it. Why reason has to have a dash through it, because every human act has to entail in that act the realization that it must annihilate itself to make opening the quality of being. This is what is crazy. Because the human mind, this is where it's so tricky to be human. The human mind, to think a thought To do something, the human mind must think a thought. Not a thought that you hold back from, but that you give yourself entirely to do it well. But then you have to realize that the thing you give yourself over to is something that will fail. And yet in knowing it will fail, you still don't hold yourself back from it.
Yeah.
What the heck? Well, this is what Hegel would talk the movement from understanding to reason, from AA to AB. This is the nihilation in Hegel. This is every why must have a dash to it. And this is what, and it makes sense too, because what do kids do? They say, why do you do that? Well, it's because of this. Why that? Why? Why is an infinite chain, right? So likewise, what's really weird is you also have to understand that the main business of the human brain is to trick you, is to be self-deceptive, to run. Right. It's a survival mechanism. So you have to use your brain to go, what is the why behind this emotion, knowing that whatever answer you give is immediately going to fall back into the calculus of self-deception. So every answer has to have a frickin' dash through it. Well, likewise, the brain would love us to believe that we can just follow our emotions and never think about it. Because then they could start to self-deceive us and we won't know we're being self-deceived. So our emotional experiences have to have a dash through them. Our intuitions have to have a dash through it. But this would mean the human being is primarily a creature or being that is engaged in an act of doing that then negates what you just did. Doing and then negate what you just did. But negation is not the same as erasure. In Hegel, a negation is a sublation. When I do a dash through the y, that is not the same as erasing the y. That is to sublate it to a higher y. This is the trick. Every negation, you're negating it because you're realizing it's always incomplete. But incomplete does not mean wrong. When I look at if I cover, if I'm looking at the bookcase and it's through a small hole and I only see a little bit of the bookcase, is what I see wrong? No, it's incomplete, right? This is the key. So when you have y with a dash through it, it's not that you're so much dealing with wrong, it's that you realize that you're following something that's incomplete. But this is the trick now. Thinking and always having a dash through it, the function of thinking is to always be what? Moving. You never arrive. That's the key, because if it's never complete, then there's always movement. Oh, well, if you're always moving, when does self-deception happen? When you stop, when you don't move anymore. But if there's always a dash, you have to keep going. And just when you think you've figured it out, you go, wait, no, dash. Okay, no, I'm full of crap. I thought I was. The dash, because if thinking for Aristotle is always movement, then if there's always a dash through your why, the why is always moving. If there was always a dash through your intuition, your emotions are always moving. You never get to weaponize anything because you never get a solid ground by which to make a military base. Because that's the key. People use their emotions as weapons. They use their thoughts as weapons. But if you're always moving, you can't really do that because you're not so sure that you should be defending this spot because there's a dash through your why. So it becomes more difficult to move into a defensive posture because you're always negating yourself just when you think you know what you should defend, right? And what you end up defending is the continual motion. You defend anyone that would tell you to stop. You defend yourself from that temptation, right? And so there always has to be a dash through it. But this is completely counter to how the brain presents reality to you. When I look at that bookcase, I don't look at that bookcase and think of it as a dash through it. I say, that's a bookcase. A is A. I don't think about the fact of it's made of atoms and quarks. Actually, where is the bookcase? What is a bookcase? You don't think of all that. Your brain, the first thing your brain does is go, that's a bookcase, done, nothing to think about. So you literally have to train your brain to not do what it naturally does, in the same way that you have to train your emotions to not make you feel justified automatically. Like when you're angry, your emotions say to you, yeah, you should be angry because that person's a jerk. And so you can't let your emotions do your thinking for you, nor can you let your thinking trick you into not moving anymore. But again, what we see here is everything then is metaphorically more like an art. Everything metaphorically is more like a gymnasium. Everything metaphorically is way more like a continual skill set that you are constantly training to keep you moving. And you're always putting a dash through these things so that you don't allow yourself to fall back into temptations of self-deception. And then and then I'll give it back to you. Where this brings in themos. Ah, gosh, did I say it more? Themos. You know, where this brings in themos is that all of that is thematic. Self-defense, movement, the themos, you know, Achilles, the fight, the battle. Themos, I'm a Greek. Yeah, it's the fingers, really. It's the trick. Themos. You know, it's the fight, right? The Achilles, the battle. It's this kind of continual fight, and it's also the need for social recognition, right? There's this kind of need in a society to be recognized, but the problem is, recognition comes with the temptation of a stable state, because you want to be recognized as what? Right. You want to be recognized as best. You want to be recognized as rational, as controlling yourself. So what you do is, instead of locating themos in this recognition of pride, you locate it in the continual battle. That's where you get your themos from. You get it from the continual negation of the why versus being seen as having the why. Because it takes a real battle with your soul, with yourself, to keep the why negated. It's a fight, right? But that fight is what you need to have meaning, because a lot of what they talk about as the meaning crisis is more like a themos crisis. You know, it's more of that. But the problem is, you say, well, what does that mean? We need to go out and fight people? No, you need to fight yourself on a stable why. You need to fight yourself from not having a dash through all your terms. You then become the battleground of the themos, of the negation through these whys, because once you do that, you're open to what? The other. You're open to the other person, because you're not allowing yourself to create a stable state where you can defend yourself from the other person. So, and then I'll give it back to you. So what this does then is, we can see how, because for the classical soul, you got to have eros, logos, and themos. But there's this real question, you know, I'm trying, it's all thanks to you. There's this issue on how can you bring back themos in 2024 without starting World War III? Well, this can do it. You locate it within this continual act of the human being against the self-deception, against the temptation to fall back on the why, and the continual action of the dash through the words. This is themotic. And this is what we need. And if we don't do that, because if you don't do that, you are not undergoing the conditions necessary to turn life into an art, to engage, because there's something thematic about the artistic practice, the act of writing. There's a challenge in that. And when you bring that in, well, then you start, you know, meeting the condition of experiencing life as beautiful. Because I sometimes think, instead of asking, you know, what is the meaning of your life, you know, you kind of ask, what do you find beautiful? Like, a lot of times when people talk about meaning, they're really more so talking about experiences of beauty. Oh, well, that's what? The full emotional experience. Well, how do you have that? You got to have logos, eros, and themos. And the only way to get all three of those is to do what we're saying, and then the continual negation of the why is important. But let me give it back to you. So themos, I appreciate, you know, I'll practice it in the mirror a bunch.
My God, my dad is somewhere is so happy. Especially because you're American. So it's like, you know, like it's especially how Americans say Greek words. There is, because there is a sense with themos that it's to do with how truly alive you are, right? Like it's an enlivening aspect. And because I know that they talk about it as spiritedness, right? Like to have, right? But again, to me, this just directly relates to unblocking, you know, like you have to have access to these very powerful core emotional states in order to be able to access themos. And I don't know that they're one and the same thing. It seems to be a little bit different. But there's this deadening quality to the human condition, right? People just sort of wandering around dead inside, like, you know, and then for people that use sort of like a hyper rationality as one of their defenses against feeling emotion, which is a large proportion of people, then they're also in the realm of feeling very justified, feeling sort of quite self-righteous, very ordered and mechanical and calm all the time, very one note. And life just loses, like it's such a loss. It's such a loss because everything becomes dulled, and there's no art, there's no creativity when you're operating from that place. And so all of this, I love everything you're saying. Super, super helpful to the way I'm thinking about it. It just reinforces for me this vital need for people to have a clearer sense of what we're even talking about when we talk about emotions, right? Just the basic distinction of internal experience versus action. What we mean when we talk about like a full experience versus just some experience, how it relates to anxiety, how it relates to depression, how it relates to disconnection and loneliness, like just chronic loneliness. That in order to ever really be able to connect deeply with another person, to have, you choose which relationships, right? You don't have to do it with everyone, but in order to ever have a relationship where you really feel connected to someone, you can't do it without knowing what full access to emotional experience is like. That will deepen your connection to others, that deepens our ability to relate. It just reinforces how important that is and how lacking our training for that is.
What you're saying is a huge deal. And well, a lot of what you're getting at to me, there's a lot of talk in Freud, Lacan of like the death drive, right? And it's kind of this hysteric, weird concept, what's going on. I think for me, I like to sometimes think about kind of the irony drive. And the irony drive, what I mean by that is you were talking about how rationality has this kind of deadening quality. The issue is that I would argue the death drive is kind of the rationality drive, in the sense of what we do is the brain says the way, but it's ironic because the reason you follow rationality alone is because you think this is the most rational thing to do. Thus, it's best for life. So the death drive is a result of you doing what you think is good for life that ends up deadening it. So it's ironic. And so to me, this starts to get at, because if we talk about the death drive as, and this isn't what Freud means or anything, as this kind of intentional desire of committing suicide, that's how it can sound, then we actually can't understand that the death drive is kind of more so getting at the self-deception drive, of which is a result of us naturally, almost seemingly wanting to believe that rationality is all we need to be human. It's almost, it does seem as if the human being desires, because Lacan's whole thing is that the brain is always drenched in libido, right? What's weird is it's almost like the human wants to believe that all we need is rationality, because it's almost like it's safer, you have more control, and of course it makes sense. But that's the whole point. It makes sense to just be rational. Well, yes, because rationality sets the board by its own terms to where it makes sense to only be rational, because it only allows the data into itself of which would conclude that. It sets the board, right? So we end up in a kind of death drive in the sense that we end up living according to a rationality that tells us what we need to do to then be alive, which actually defines being alive as deadening, of flattening. And that irony drive then, I think, helps us understand the meaning crisis. Because there's a lot of talk about the meaning crisis as a need to get back to religion, as a need to get back to spiritual practices. Ecologies of practices, Vervaeke will talk about. I do not in any way whatsoever say that is not true. I am not saying that. But you could return to religion and still be self-deceived. You could return to religion and still be operating according to a death drive, because for Freud, the death drive is about getting back to the womb, right? And that's kind of a death drive because you want to get back. Well, rationality kind of creates a womb. It creates a world that's stable and it's in control, and all you got to do is follow the mechanical steps and everything's good to go, right? So rationality, if you do not introduce it to non-rationality, is simulating a return to the womb, which then is why what I'll say, like, autonomous rationality is auto-cannibalistic, because what you're doing is creating a womb by actually kind of eating yourself. You're your womb, right? Which, of course, doesn't make any sense, and you end up kind of devouring yourself on the nutrition of your own brain, which means your brain is feeding off of itself and it dies, to be really violent for a second there, but, death drive and all. So what ends up happening is that the death drive is the rationality drive that seeks to think that all it needs is rationality, which then simulates a return to the womb, which of course then it defines as being fully alive, which is precisely to be dead in a deadening state, which is the meaning crisis. And if we don't understand this irony that is fundamental, because like irony is the fabric of reality, if we don't understand this irony that is at the heart of the human being in wanting to believe that rationality is all we need. Wanting is a key word in the sense of libido, desire. If we don't understand that, then in the name of life, we're going to do anti-life. We're going to engage in practices of anti-life. But this would mean that to resist the death drive is precisely the introduction of the non-rationality of saying, well, actually, no, emotions are just as important. Actually, it's important you leave the womb. Actually, if you stay in the womb, you die. To go into emotion is to leave the womb. Because there's a way in which you don't have emotion in the womb, right? I mean, technically, yes, I understand the stress of the mother,
you're
but
part of you're not even distinct.
That's correct. So to go into emotion is to leave the womb. And rationality doesn't want to do that, because when you go into emotion, it's hard. And then rationality says, told you so. This is the key. So you leave rationality, go into emotion, it's hard, and your brain says, told you shouldn't have left the room. And this is where the choice and agency is huge. This is where the non-rationality and the themos is big, because you look at your brain that is telling you should have never left the womb, and you say, I do not regret my choice. And that's the stand, that's the Achilles, that's the fight, and you don't return to the womb, and you face the emotion, and you figure it out, which has this thymotic quality to it, without which there is no possibility of overcoming a meaning crisis, because you'll just do what's quote-unquote rational, move back into the womb. Just like in Japan, everyone's living in the apartments, the social capital is collapsing, people aren't having babies. All of these things, the demographic crisis, speak to returning to the womb of rationality, of which seems rational because it hurts to leave it. But if you don't leave it, you can't grow, because you can't grow inside the womb. So I think it ties to the death drive, the irony drive, and things like that.
It's all developmentally linked, isn't it? It's all this. Just so much of this boils down to the disruption in the developmental progress, I guess, the developmental trajectory, right? You know, when you're in a womb, or even soon after you're born, yes, you are seeking containment, you're seeking comfort, you're seeking more and more over time a level of distinction of self versus other, autonomy, right? But this is so much of what happens here is about arrested development. You know, we are stuck at points in our developmental trajectory. We are stuck unconsciously in places where we are seeking the womb. We are seeking comfort, containment, and we can use our mind to create that to some degree, right? We're trying to use our mind, and in a context and a society where that is being reinforced to us all the time, that's the best thing you can do, you know, and you know, you should be training your mind, you should be thinking more, become more rational. This is all just reinforced, and it comes down to attachment needs. It always comes down to attachment needs. You know, ultimately, so much of this disruption comes about because we are so motivated biologically to attach, right, and to remain attached. Our attachment drive, right, and our attachment needs at whatever cost, right, like at whatever cost. I just need to keep this relationship somewhat workable, right? You know, when you're a child, that is somewhat workable, and it's so hardwired into us that our mind is involved in finding out all these ways and to help us to do that, to orient towards that at whatever cost. Not allowed to have this emotion with this person, never have that again, put that down there, right? You know, oh, it's breaking through, like here's lots and lots of anxiety to make you feel so uncomfortable that you'll do anything you can to run in the opposite direction from that emotion and use your mind to do so often. That's not working, here's depression, right? Like just feel nothing. Right, just be completely flattened, but you still get your attachment relationship to some degree, right? So you know, sacrificing autonomy for this this less than ideal attachment relationship, right, is and then getting arrested there. Like that is where the damage gets done. And then you're kind of living with this model forevermore, and it never gets updated. And so much of what happens in therapy is trying to make clear that there may have been a time and place where all of this that you're living right now, this model within which you live, all made sense, right? But you're not there anymore. It's like an outdated system that has nothing to do anymore, oftentimes has nothing to do anymore with what's going on. And when you can get clear on that, that can sometimes be part of the buy-in that helps to frame it. But it's difficult to wrap one's head around how we even go about trying to rectify any of this without it being about the first few years of life. You know, that obviously there are ways that later on we can start to address it. Obviously, that's part of what a successful therapy does. And there are other ways that people manage to do that, of course. But it is frightening to think that so much of this is coming about so early on in life. And it is a phase in time where people are just more and more so under such stress, right? And their own self-delusions and their own internal conflicts going on and their own running from their emotions. And then they have children and talk about like unconscious triggers. Like you have a child, and then all of a sudden, whether you know it or not, there's going to be all this stuff about your own childhood that gets activated. And right, yeah, it's really the time in which, yeah. So yes, I love the way you're drawing all of this together. It's really helping to clarify some things in my mind. My mind keeps going back to that statement though, the rigor of mystery. And I'm not sure why, but this, yeah, I don't know if anything I said there was.
Oh, it was one everything you said is fantastic. I think the phrase, well, basically, if it is the responsibility of parents to introduce their children to the rigor of mystery as soon as possible, and to they themselves be submitted as parents to the rigor of mystery that is disclosed to them by their children to themselves, so that they themselves might be more like that Nietzschean child who is able to see in that mystery and find joy in it. I don't know where 2 hours go. It just flies.
Oh, yeah.
So this is, but I've enjoyed this immensely. But a lot of what you were saying there, I think one of the great problems is that we're still in a paradigm of right or wrong. Is this right or is this wrong? And with that, you can't start moving into these practices, these arts, these sort of processes or different things. And I think a lot. And I've mentioned it before, on the movement in Dante from the Inferno to the Purgatorio to the Paradiso. What's very interesting in the Inferno is, a lot of like morality is like right, wrong, good, bad, right? And you see, I think basically that's all we're in ever. And our development is arrested in that kind of thinking, which is very like rational. True, false, good, bad, very binary. And I think society has a giant kind of arrested development in that. And from the Enlightenment and so on, there's a kind of collective arrested development. And you were saying at the beginning on the idea that this is, basically the entire sociological paradigm is one giant rational womb. That's what we're in. And you see, that's why if you start to do what's non-rational, you feel irrational because it goes against the social order. It goes against the Peter Berger plausibility structure. Like the psychoanalytical is also the social analytical. They're always feeding one another. What happens in the therapy office is happening in the work office. It all kind of interconnects because you see the human being, as we know from like Ask Conformity Experiments, Milgram, we tend to determine if we're doing what we should do based on what other people are doing. And if other people are living with traumas, we're like, well, there's something wrong with me if I don't have trauma. Or if they're arrested development, I need arrested development. So then if you step out of the social death drive, that is the collective rational drive that leads to this return to the womb of the Enlightenment, if you will, you're going to feel like you're crazy. But that precisely is what you must feel to leave the womb. It is kind of crazy to leave the womb, but it also kills you if you don't. It deadens you. So you got to do something crazy to live. And you see that what's kind of feeding all of that is we only have this kind of binary right, wrong, or different things like that. But what I think is insanely critical is that as you move into the Paradiso, there's this concept that Dante is constantly entertaining. It's like, hey, Dante, you know, joy can kill you, by the way. If you're introduced to like joy too soon, if you do beauty too quickly, it will actually reduce you to ash. This key image. So Dante's talking with Beatrice, and he's kind of upset. He's like, Beatrice, why won't you smile? And he says, because if I did, because you yourself have not developed to the place where you can handle the fullness of God's glory, it would actually reduce you to ash, like Semele facing Zeus. And so the idea is that Beatrice has to gradually move Dante to the place where then at the top of the Paradiso, she can smile. So the idea is that joy, grace, happiness, all of these things are things that people have to be gradually introduced to because of their sins and wounds, as Dante would talk about, because of their own pains. Like if you try to introduce people too soon to the fullness of the human experience, it reduces them to ash. I think there's one part, it might be like at the beginning of the Purgatory, where they run in, it's like Dante's entering and there's these dancers and they run up and like, Dante, what are you doing here? And Cleo was talking about it, like, Dante, what are you doing here? Don't you know this is a place of joy? Like as if it's dangerous to be here. Yeah. And I see, yeah. And what the key is when we're talking about art, rigor of mystery, to me, what I hear in that is the rigor of Beatrice, to keep moving like Aristotle, but introduce gradually more and more mystery as he simultaneously develops in his character to receive it and to handle it, which then compels him onward like a dojo teacher to the place where he can handle the full smile and thus the fullness of the mystery. He cannot be introduced to the beatific vision until he moves to the top. If the beatific vision is introduced to him at the bottom of the Paradiso, it will kill him. And there's something similar to human beings. Like the only way to experience the fullness of joy is developmentally. That's kind of the trait. Like the only way is a developmental logic. And you see, that is the logic of the Paradiso. The problem is we're stuck in the logic of the Inferno and halfway of the Purgatorio. Beatrice shows up about halfway of the Purgatorio, which means the entire social order has arrested development in a binary logic, which is great for law and basic ethics and don't murder people. But once you move beyond the don't murder people, okay, I'm not murdering my friends. What now? We don't have any idea because we don't have a social practice of Beatrice. We have a social order of don't do bad things. Okay, but how do I do good things? Don't know, but don't do bad things. You'll figure it out. Actually, I won't because I'm like weighed down by trauma in my own childhood. Well, figure it out. And we don't, of course. So we have not socially or globally transitioned from a logic of the Inferno and the Purgatorio to the logic of Beatrice, which is basically the logic of psychoanalysis and therapy. That's basically what Beatrice is the logic of working through to be able to handle the fullness of joy, because Beatrice is an art form. Beatrice, and the key too, I would also say with Beatrice, and this is true of relationships, she's literally telling Dante that if I smile too soon, heaven will kill you. It's pretty wild. See, like literally the glory of heaven is going to kill you, like a Lovecraft creature is how I put it. And so what's interesting is what are the greatest pains in people's lives usually caused by? Their loved ones, the people they care most about. That is what Beatrice is talking about, is that without the right care or the right art form, heaven is Lovecraftian. Heaven is a force of destruction. Joy will kill you. We have not thought this. We can't think this where rationality and emotion are too distinct, where mind and body are separate. What Beatrice is talking about is unthinkable under the wrong paradigm of what thinking is or what emotion is, and if we don't have the why with the dash on it. Because that's basically what Beatrice is like. The why I don't smile is a dash through it. It is the movement. You have to move to the place where you can see it. You can never settle. So we were saying thought and emotion have to be a movement, a continual movement, Aristotle. That's what Beatrice is saying. And Beatrice is saying is there is a certain art to this that is possible. So the meaning crisis in a way is a lack of a Beatrice. There is no Beatrice in society. There is no social order of training people according to Beatrice. Not children, not adults, not schools, not business people. The meaning crisis can be seen as one giant collective lack of the skills of Beatrice. And the question is, what would it look like to gain those? What would it look like to do those things? Well, if we don't even know we need that beatrific, structure, you can't even begin to do that. So again, there's all these things that have to be cleared. all these ways of thinking about what thinking is that have to be cleared. If you know the divide between the outer and inner space, that has to be thought. If you think all of these things and you feel all of these things, well, then you can move, and I give it back to you. You can move through the logic and the life and the dance of Beatrice to the place of the beatific vision, which is where love, you know, where the wings fail the lofty fantasy, and you see the love that moves the sun and other stars, and that is a full emotional experience. But you have to be worked to the place of that full emotional experience, and unless you're worked there, you cannot get there. Thus, the need for a social acknowledgement of the art of a Beatrice.
Outstanding. As you often say, outstanding. Oh, I'm so alive. You can't experience full joy, right? Full love, the fullness of the positive emotions as well. You cannot experience them to their fullest extent without being able to do the same with the other emotions. It is through the pathway of looking at the parts of us that we don't want to look at, having the full internal experience of the things inside us that might horrify us to see, right? Not to do in reality, but just the internal experience and the associated impulse that comes with it, that has been hidden under so many layers. Without the heavy work of doing that, you necessarily restrict yourself from the full experience of all the others. And I love the way that you put that, because ultimately that is the purpose, right, of therapy. It's not here, try and see if you can look at anger in its fullest extent inside you, and these other painful feelings and guilt and, you know, and grief, and just have the full experience of them. Good, you're done. It's in order to then open you up to noticing that you can have a fuller experience of the other emotions too. You can now have a fuller experience of the other, of a person, of a relationship, of yourself, right, of connection. And it's yeah, I just, the way you put that was beautiful. And it's so reflective of what I think the point of the therapy is ultimately. But you have to be able to look at the horror first. You have to be able to go into the deepest pain first. And what you were talking about just the instruction over and over, just don't do bad. Just don't do bad. Don't care about anything else. You'll sort everything. Just don't do bad, right? It's so true. And then when people confuse that with don't notice anything bad inside you, like don't notice any impulse inside you that might want to do bad, that might want to hurt another person, right? Don't ever notice that impulse. Then it's also, you're on your own about everything else. But also don't you dare pay attention to your feelings, because sometimes you'll confuse that with doing bad, and that's what you're supposed to not be doing. So don't do bad with your actions. Don't pay attention to your feelings. And I don't know what else you're going to do, but just, you're on your own. Right. Yeah, that was the way you brought that together at the end, was just so robust, and joyful, and joyful. Yeah, I always get an immense sense of joy when I speak with you. You have a way of just bringing threads together and illuminating new threads that I kind of know are there, but I can't quite. Yeah, you have the rigor of mystery about you, which is why I always really enjoy our conversations.
Well,
Yeah.
that's very kind of you, Aspasia, and I enjoy them as well. Well, this has been a complete delight. I've enjoyed speaking with you. I look forward to doing it again, and thank you for sharing your thought. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and again, the only way that Dante can get to the Paradiso is to go through Inferno. The way is blocked. There's no other way but to go through the Inferno. It is an incredibly, psychoanalytical therapeutic text, that Dante is putting forth and walking forth. And then at the end of it, the point is a beatific vision, not just a beatific thought or idea, but a full emotional experience. And that just cannot be overstated. Well, Aspasia, I hope you have a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for your time. This has been a treat. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All the best to you. Thank you. Have a good one. All the best.